Good evening, I'm Mike Wallace. In recent weeks, we've been discussing the problems of a free society and what it must do to survive. Tonight, we'll try to measure the impact of our free society on us as individuals, whether we're as happy as we like to think we are, or as free to think and to feel. Our guest is Dr. Erich Fromm, a psychoanalyst and social critic who is internationally renowned for his studies of men and their search for freedom. Dr. Fromm, first let me ask you this. From many different quarters, the United States, I think you will agree, has been criticized as a materialistic society, perhaps even a shallow society. Yet only recently you said this. You said there has never been a better society than in the United States in 1958. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean it, of course, in relative terms. The history of man so far is nothing to brag about from the standpoint of our ideals. And what I mean is that in comparison with most other societies, our present-day American society has achieved things which are remarkable. Material wealth greater than for any other nation, a relative freedom from oppression, a relative mobility, spreading of art, of music, of thought, which is also rather unique. So I would say compared with the 19th century, compared with most previous history, this is as good a better society than any which man has ever made. But that doesn't mean it is such a good one.
Well, that's the point. At the same time, you make this apparently contradictory statement because you also said earlier this week, if the United States goes on in the direction it is taking, it is in serious danger of destroying itself. Now, how? In what ways?
Well, Mr. Wallace, I would say, if I would put it generally, because in our enthusiasm to dominate nature and to produce more material goods, we have transformed means into ends. We wanted to produce more in the 19th century and the 20th century in order to give man the possibility for a more dignified human life. But actually what has happened is that production and consumption have ceased to be means and have become ends. And we are production crazy and consumption crazy.
Well, I would like to get your views, with that as a background, I'd like to get your views as a psychoanalyst on specific instances, on what is happening to us as individuals. For instance, what would you say is happening to man, American man, in relationship to his work?
I think his work is to a large extent meaningless because he is not related to it. He is increasingly part of a big machinery, social machinery, governed by a big bureaucracy. And I think American man unconsciously hates his work very often because he feels trapped by it, imprisoned by it, because he feels that he's spending most of his energy for something which has no meaning in itself.
But if we mean by insane, a lack of sanity, then indeed I think whole societies can be insane, and many societies have been insane, and I'm afraid we are on the way to it too unless some drastic changes occur. But I have to add one remark here. There are two concepts of sanity. A society can be sane in the sense that people adjust themselves to it and to its norms. But it can be insane in the universal sense of what is good for man as he exists. In fact, all the great norms, whether you take the Ten Commandments or the teachings of Buddha or the teachings of Christ, are norms of human sanity, which refer to human existence, to mankind, and they are all based on the idea also that the loyalty to man and the values in man are higher than the loyalties to any given societies and the values represented by it.
Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The psychoanalyst Erich Fromm once remarked that even if millions of people share the same vices, it doesn't make those vices virtues. Even if they share many errors, it doesn't make the errors truths. Even if millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology, it doesn't make these people sane. In fact, society as a whole may be lacking sanity and can be crazy making for large numbers of individuals. As Frohm put it, escaping to freedom is positive freedom because it allows us to have the capacity to experience spontaneous, loving relationships with others in nature without eliminating our own individuality. If we're driven to escape from freedom, it becomes a negative freedom in which a large number of people turn to a toxic, destructive authoritarianism, losing their individuality to the state of bureaucracy. Love is the only sane answer to human existence as we struggle with the paradox of the two freedoms. Today on The Radical Imagination, we have two guests who are trying to build a saner, more loving, less toxic America in the humanist tradition of Erich Fromm. Karina Aybar is a bilingual clinical social worker, therapist, and coach who uses her diagnostic skills to help women overcome their anxiety, fear, low self-esteem, depression, toxic relationships, and career challenges in a caring, confidential, and empowering space. She practices at the Innovative Counseling Center in Manhattan. Kerwin Kaye is an associate professor of sociology and American studies at Wesleyan University, where he specializes in feminist, gender, and sexuality studies. He's written on the models of addiction utilized by drug courts and affiliated treatment programs, highlighting the mixed consequences that state-supervised treatment brings to participants. In an earlier project, Kerwin has written about the lived realities and changing social understandings of male prostitution. And his most recent book, most interesting title too, is Enforcing Freedom, Drug Courts, Therapeutic Communities, and the Intimacies of the State. Well, welcome both of you to the Radical Imagination. It's a real honor to have you both here and look forward to this discussion very, very much. We're starting the show with a couple of clips from the great psychoanalyst Erich Fromm in an interview he had back in 1958 with Chris Wallace. And of course, a couple of the quotes that I've had here. So it just struck me, and as I was reading your work, I was looking at the clips that you've had, that you sent to me, that much of your work comes from that tradition. The questioning of labeling, the power of the state. What is the nature of mental illness? How do we define it? The consequences of the drug war, and so on, and empowering people. And the necessity to look at the sane society versus a society that makes us, or many of us, crazy. Because it's, as Fromm put it, it creates people who are motivated and are working toward what they consider a meaningless existence, in a sense. They don't really have that meaning in their life. And this causes all sorts of havoc and so on. Anyway, that's a long and short of trying to get us going on this discussion. Tell me, does that make sense to you in terms of your own work? Let's start with Karina. Do you see yourself, again, empowering people to stand up, not to just conform to the society, right? Tell us a little about your own work, your own contributions, and how you got started as this clinical social worker and therapist and coach.
Okay, thank you very much again. It is an honor to be here. Thank you for hosting this platform, very much needed.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to say or kindly correct that I do not empower people, but I help them empower themselves. And I think that the quote resonated a lot, especially with my work, because I like to think of the person in environment. And when I think of mental health, it is not an individualistic thing, although psychiatry and, in more recent years, or even I would say post 60s, we have been trained to have this notion that mental illness has to do with chemical imbalances, etc. And I do think that we have to think of it as a balance. Yes, of course, the individual can have chemical imbalances and stressors that may cause them to derail and not function properly within society. But we also have to not absolve the system from its responsibility to provide the means for which people can be mentally stable and well, basically. I can help and treat someone and create a plan for them to be more resilient, have a more resilient mindset, to take personal accountability. Perhaps, do some homework when we facilitate, affirmations, or what is within my power that I can do in order to alleviate this stressor, this situation. However, if my client is, has to worry about fundamental resources or needs such as housing and living paycheck to paycheck, or being one mistake away from being fired, that is not the individual's fault. So we have to take a global look at mental health and well-being, and not blame the individual for structural issues that we must constantly bring awareness to and continuously fight.
That sounds like a little bit of a sociological explanation there, correct? I mean, she's this has been a battle since psychiatry began, right? This notion that there was a biological determinism. We understand that perhaps a small minority of people with mental illness have something medically or biologically wrong with them, some organic brain damage or chemical imbalance. But certainly Freud didn't believe that. I mean, he again saw the problem as internal psychic conflicts. But again, what you're raising here is so important that we need to broaden, expand our understanding of the field, to look at those larger structural issues that impact us and interact with us and so on. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And again, I think it's so important for the individual to take responsibility, for us to facilitate, and it is quite legitimate that people may suffer from chemical imbalances. But I always like to start within my therapy sessions. I like to explore, and this is more of like a Maslow's approach, hierarchy of needs. Like, okay, is the person having their fundamental needs met? What's causing this? Then let's look at the interpersonal relationships. But quite often my clients come suffering from imposter syndrome and what I like to call internalized capitalism, that while they're not diagnoses that are in the DSM-4, they are these conditions for where people believe that their failures, whether it's, I'm not meeting certain standards by certain timelines within this age, however, it must be my fault. There must be something wrong with me. So there's a sense of inadequacy. And they also attribute their level, their sense of worth to their level of productivity.
Yeah, that's so important, right? Because in capitalism, we make such a point of the individual and the individualism that stress. If you don't, as you point out, if you don't make it, it's your fault. And we come to internalize so many negative labels and so on. So Kerwin, you've talked a lot about this in your book, haven't you? And so expand on what Karina's just said.
Sure. Well, I totally agree with everything that Karina is talking about so far. It's on point. And my work really focused on as you mentioned, the drug court and the affiliated treatment programs that they send people to. And I was really interested in the way in which the courts and the treatment centers sort of operationalize the idea of addiction when they know that no one's using drugs because they're testing people regularly. So how do you know that somebody's getting better if no one is actually using drugs? And how do they define this concept of addiction? And particularly interested in how that was happening within this criminal justice system and this sort of new approach to therapeutic courts or therapeutic jurisprudence that has arisen within the court system and sort of has received a lot of support from both liberals and conservatives. And so what I found was that the case managers and the treatment professionals all agreed that they wanted to do more than get people off of drugs. They wanted to treat what they called the drugs lifestyle, or sometimes informally they might call it get rid of dope fiend behaviors. But so what is this drugs lifestyle? And what they would describe is people who were unable to delay gratification, or people who were unable to establish a strong work ethic, or who were personally irresponsible. And the treatment, and I realized at a certain point that what had happened with the drugs lifestyle is that the things I was hearing about the drugs lifestyle were the same things that were said in the 1960s about the so-called culture of poverty from Oscar Lewis and Daniel Moynihan. And the culture of poverty itself was an interesting concept because at that time, the culture of poverty emerged as a way, I think, to talk about, to sort of talk about issues of race without mentioning them explicitly. So it just so happened that the people who suffered from the culture of poverty were disproportionately Latino and Black, and those were the contexts in which they talked about the culture of poverty. So it was a way of talking of enacting racism without being explicitly racist and talking about culture instead of race. And then again, that got transposed, I think, into this concept of addiction. So what was really happening is that they were taking these very old concepts of race and using them to define what was happening with addiction. And that's how sort of addiction got operationalized. And so they were effectively using psychiatric or psychological methods to treat what they saw as flaws that were rooted in an individual character that had to do with these sort of racist stereotypes. And the solution, as they saw it, to much of these problems was work. And so what they were doing is that they were taking a population that had a lot of involvement in street hustling and street life, and they were defining that as this drugs lifestyle, or using these racist stereotypes to characterize what street life was about. And they were taking these things that were adaptive to life on the street or with heavy street involvement and pathologizing them, and then doing things therapeutically in order to make the person more prepared for low-wage labor. And so that meant getting used to boring tasks, getting used to taking orders, following hierarchies, getting yelled at a lot and not responding in kind because maybe your boss isn't going to be so pleasant in the sectors that we're talking about. And, and if people would talk back, they would, literally say things like, what, your boss is going to yell at you and you're going to respond like that, you'll be out of a job. So they're just like, it's very explicit what some of these connections are. But so work, and in particular for the folks going through these programs in low wage sector environments, is the solution for the drugs lifestyle and so on. So basically it was a way of dealing with questions of poverty and racialized poverty and individualizing that problem through this language of addiction and a psychiatric diagnosis, and then treating it by putting people in programs that used a rhetoric of addiction, but primarily, as I saw it, were really focused on issues around work more than anything else. They certainly didn't offer very much of the types of therapeutic support that I've certainly received through counselors during various parts of my life. Support rooted in sort of questioning and open discussion and exploration, and sort of creating a nurturant environment that was very unlike what these therapeutic environments were like, which involved a lot of shouting and discipline. And that's really what the treatment sort of focused on.
Well put. And yeah, this idea of work, and again, reducing people's difficulties in life to individual character flaws, laziness, shiftlessness. It just goes on and on. That was also the reason for people on welfare. They just didn't work hard enough, and so on and so on. So the therapeutic model was brought in. It came to be seen as a kinder, gentler way, but it was still regulating and enforcing this class-based, race privilege reality on people. And as you say, the clinicians, the social workers were put in the position of yelling and Karina, you don't yell at your
no, never.
Yeah, I mean, this is so foreign to what is really needed.
For sure.
Yeah. Can we take maybe another step on this? As I was saying to both of you before the show, we've had Carl Hart on the show numerous times, actually, in his recent book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups. And he also has this provocative subtitle, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. Now, I don't know if either one of you had a chance to look at this, but this goes beyond his first book, High Price, and in which he documents a lot of the things you're both talking about in terms of the drug war. And he's calling for a decriminalization and a legalization of all drugs. I'm not just talking about pot here, and that people should come out of the closet, and that we need education more than anything, drug use for grown-ups, and that's what he believes needs to happen. I don't know where, if any, use there would be there would be not much use for these drug courts, it seems to me. So let me get both your opinions on this. What do you think? Are we ready, or in the near future, to consider, the legalization? I think in Oregon, there's a couple of places in the country that's doing that. So how would that fit into your practice, Karina? Yeah, you're just sort of I know this is tough to, and it should be remarked, as he points out, he has done the research for 20 years as a neuroscientist. He has admitted and does use these drugs himself. And so the professional classes, I mean, Kerwin, you go down to Wall Street, half of Wall Street is bouncing off walls. the music industry. All right, and so on. So anyway, no, but I'm curious. I'm looking at you here, Karina, and your response. So tell us about what you think about that.
Well, to whether we are ready to legalize drugs, are we ready? Well, as you mentioned, that he advocates for more education, I would agree with that. Are we ready as of now? No. Right now, we have a lot of codependence on drug use, with big pharma taking over and having a profit-driven healthcare system where there's a benefit to that. So I think that it would make a lot of corporations collapse and not happy. But I think that us as a society should be prioritizing education, the consequences of drug use. But I think that there is definitely a profit model behind it, and which is why you see that there is criminalization of persons who have misdemeanor by, like recently we legalized marijuana, but there's a whole business behind it. And the most affected are persons of color. So are we ready? Not at this moment, but I think that it can be possible with education and proper accountability when it comes to eliminating that profit basis. I would say we can definitely move forward into not only legalizing like marijuana, but perhaps other drugs. I would say I would need to get more acquainted, because I know that there are effects in the long run. So we wouldn't want people to become codependent. I think that's the key to facilitate the resources necessary for people to have the information and not also have the need to numb themselves and resort to drugs in order to escape.
Yeah. Carl points out that 85 to 90% of people, again, who use heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine, pot, and so on, do not become addicted. They're able to function. They carry on. And in fact, he makes a point that drugs, including alcohol, add a lot to our lives. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be dangerous. And that's what he means by educating people in their drug use if they choose to. He's not saying go out and do this, but people are going to. A certain percentage of people in all societies have done this, have chosen to do this. And our drug wars, drug courts, the response, certainly what we need to do, as I think you both would agree, is to restructure people's lives economically, give them the opportunities to enjoy the opportunities and benefits that America is supposedly all about, and it hasn't done that. But again, that transition phase in which we would come to grips with the fact, and he puts it in the drug use for grown-ups. This is for grown-ups here. This is not for kids. These are for people who have made a decision, and how you can educate yourself and how he educates people through safe use of these drug habits. Now, we can get, you mentioned, how did you put it moralistic? To use a sort of moral term here, to become codependent. What was the other term you meant? You mentioned, Karina, that that people, or somehow lacking in discipline if they resort to doing drugs?
Well, I no, I was wondering, like, eliminating or exploring what is what are the conditions that are making people so codependent and resorting to numb themselves and quote unquote seeking that freedom, by using drugs, because
No,
we
that's
have
a
to
great
take a
point.
look at that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And but doesn't our larger society numb us in other ways, as Frohm would point out? Numb us toward the commodification. Everything becomes a matter of making money, and we're so unhappy with that. So yeah, Kerwin, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I mean, I would agree with Carl Hart, and I think he's very brave for stepping forward and talking about his own drug use, which is not limited to marijuana, and is part of the harder drugs. And he's really trying to do a lot to undo stigma in doing that, and talking about the ways that many people are able to have controlled use over time and sustain that. Certainly not everyone, obviously, but I do take a small, the title of drug use for grown-ups almost implies I fear that people who can't control their drug use aren't grown-ups exactly, or I'm not sure if that implication is there. But I would thoroughly agree with him that we need, I would say, a public health approach to drug use, and to get the police out of most enforcement of drugs. So what that looks like in terms of legalization, like, I don't know that means you're going to have heroin sold at the corner store, but some sort of version of controlled distribution that is not illegal as part of it. And I think, sort of in general, the points that you all were making about the ways people are able to have controlled use or not, has a lot to do with their social circumstances. And what, there was a whole bunch of studies starting in the 60s, I believe, around Rat Park, where they looked at the studies that had been done on rats who famously preferred drugs to water so much that they would, press a little lever in order to give themselves the drugs until they died of starvation. They wouldn't eat, and instead they realized, oh, these rats are isolated alone in a little box, and those are the conditions in which they are preferring drugs to food, to the point of death. And so they created a very rat park. They created lots of rats and playing around, and lots of toys and lots of diversion and lots of stuff going on. And the rats in that environment did not, they would try some of the drug-laced water. I think they were doing an opiate with the water. And then they would sort of develop a sustained level of intake with that, and they would eat fine, and they were happy little rats, So I think that's something just to sort of keep in mind, that a lot of the studies that we're looking at have had a social environment, whether we're talking about people or rats, or and that social environment is very destructive in and of itself, as both of you have been saying. And so we need to really consider how to change that broader social environment and create, I would say, not just choose love, but choose how to create a more loving community as a whole, and that is economically sustainable and environmentally sustainable and everything. But and think about, but I guess I would say that if we pursued a public health approach, to drugs, which I would strongly advocate, we're still going to have problems with drugs. But I would rather have those problems than the problems that we get with the criminal justice system in enforcing, the drug laws. So I would not say that, well, legalizing drugs is just going to solve everything. Everything's going to go away. You might even see more people using drugs in problematic ways. That's possible. But again, I would rather have those problems than the problems that come with criminal justice. And one of the problems, just as just a real quick aside about drug courts, half the people fail at drug courts. Half the people go through drug courts and do not graduate. And so, how do you fail at treatment? Does not treatment fail you, I would think. But indeed, according to the courts, you can fail at treatment. And the 50% of people who fail, which is disproportionately Black, disproportionately Latinx, get longer sentences than ever before. Because with many drug courts, you've had to plead guilty ahead of time. You've pled guilty to the most serious charges. You lose your ability to plea bargain. So drug courts, you spend all this time trying treatment, and then you're actually punished if you fail for doing so with a longer sentence. So it's actually intensifying the war on drugs on half the people that go through the programs. I think with a public health approach, you would eliminate a lot of the problems of violence around drugs, not all of it, but much of the violence around drugs has to do with distribution and dealing rather than, people taking the drugs. So I think there's a lot of benefits to a public health approach, whatever the specifics exactly might look like on that, but you would still have problems, but I think the benefits are just enormous. And I would encourage people to look at materials from the Drug Policy Alliance, who's been doing really great work on this issue.
No, that's a great point. And just to follow up a little bit on what you just said, perhaps the system in the drug courts are set up so that a certain percentage will fail. So, absolutely. And you mentioned, and Carl does too, the need for profound transformative structural change. We've also had James Gilligan, the psychiatrist, on, who has been an international expert on violence. And generally, the answer is, this is his book, Why Some Politicians Are More Dangerous Than Others. And you mentioned the word love, but it does come down to a society that has policies that doesn't shame, humiliate, disrespect people. And over 100 years, you can look over 100 years of our electoral system, and you'll see, by and large, when Democrats come in to office, they do initiate and provide more of these sorts of programs. And lo and behold, rates of violence do go down. So the hardline punitive perspective just gets us into more and more of the problem, even though it seems like so many of us want to react almost, without thinking this is what we need to do. But Karina, again, tell us about where you're working, the Innovative Counseling Center. Tell us about that and what they're attempting to accomplish there.
Well, actually, it's that my office is in West Harlem, and with me and my colleague, Dr. Rosa Laverne. But unfortunately, due to health reasons, currently fighting breast cancer, I'm doing sessions virtually. And but we still have the office, and hoping that I can go back there. But basically, our approach, as I said, is a more of a person in environment approach, and I like to use my coaching skills as well to use thought-provoking questions and utilize techniques where the individual takes a more proactive approach, which is why we call the persons we see, or like my participants, I call them clients and not patients, because patients implies a passive role in the therapeutic process. So it's a two-way street, and I'm just a facilitator of their healing and hopefully empowerment by analyzing not only childhood traumas and ways that they affect the client currently, but also what are ways in which the person can not only take responsibility individually and overcome these narratives, but also understand the environment that they're in. And so I would say my approach, my tagline basically is building women's resilience through vulnerability. And I do serve men. I want to say that in couples, but my expertise is in women's empowerment. And so it's basically taking that compassionate approach to mental health and compassionate accountability as an individual, learning where patterns are come and what are the ways in which I can overcome through exercises, homework, lots of reading, also understanding person and environment, especially within this pandemic and the past year and everything that is going on politically. It's brought into the therapy sessions. And so this is where I always invite my clients to learn about who are the people in power, who's your council member, who's your assembly member, what can you do. You haven't been able to get unemployment benefits yet and it's been months. Guess what? How do you feel about contacting your local representative? Even if you have to spend a day. So it's like teaching a lot of like advocacy skills, because I always tell them, your best advocate is yourself.
Right.
And I'm the facilitator in that process, and I just feel honored to be able to do that and to have my clients' trust.
Yeah, and you are this community organizer too. You
Yes.
are working with the community. Over the past year with the virus, what have you noticed among your clients? Has things gotten worse for them? Yeah.
For sure.
Tell us a little bit, for sure.
Without a doubt.
The stress is enormous. So what are the sort of things they bring to you, and how have things gotten worse? How would you explain that to us?
Well, I say that this pandemic has really made the flaws of our capitalistic system more obvious. There's always a sense of isolation within capitalism, but within this pandemic, I mean, people bring the sense of, that alienation and that vulnerability and not being able to work. If they do have a job, it can be very demanding. They are overworking, and so that creates a lot of anxiety. But they're not able to quit because, I mean, how dare you? I'm so lucky to have a job in the middle of a pandemic. Meanwhile, I feel like I'm at the edge of having a breakdown and a panic attack, because the work environment is what they're bringing. A lot about the work environment, feeling isolated, not having that sense of security and or income, and fearing being evicted from their apartment, their place. And so anxiety has definitely risen tremendously, and depression as well. And so it's been a constant theme. As I mentioned before, like this notion, internalized capitalism, and the insecurity, the sense of inadequacy, and a sense of fear and lack of security, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great analysis and use of the terms. So again, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, just to pick up on
Sure.
that theme, and also something that Karina mentioned earlier about the pharmaceutical sort of domination of psychiatry. Currently we have around 1 in 6 people who take some type of psychiatric medication every year, and 80% of that is long-term use. So that's a lot of people. Most of that is antidepressants, also anti-anxiety drugs and everything else. But I think when and I should say, I don't begrudge anyone taking whatever drugs or whatever that they personally need in order to help them thrive and live and love and find their best self and to survive. But at a collective level, I think those numbers really raise a concern in that to me, they represent the fact that we've created a situation that is really unsustainable, and we're living lives that sort of capitalism and all of capitalism's effects, not just in the workplace, but also in family life and personal life, and the ways that it organizes community and fosters self-blame, as Karina has talked about. All of that has created a situation in which we're living lives that just are beyond us, and that we're, requiring sort of this artificial help to sustain in some way. And I think it just sort of is one indication of a need to go back and look more at those structural issues. Pharmaceutical companies have, and psychiatry more generally, have promoted really individualizing approaches where addiction, for example, is a brain disease, as if which, okay, fine, there are things happening in the brain. There's things happening in the brain for everything, but to limit it to only a brain disorder is to really cut off what we're thinking about what is going on and what's happening and why people are having different sorts of issues. And I think we really need to look at what those broader social structural issues are, including, everything from the stresses of unemployment and eviction that Karina was talking about, or being fearful of losing a job, to the types of stresses that happen at higher end professional things. Jim, you mentioned, that there's a lot of drug use happening on Wall Street. That's we know that. And not all that drug use is nicely controlled and sort of life enhancing in some way. So, I think we really need to look at the ways that the structures in our society, and capitalism in particular, as well as its close affiliates, racism and sexism, heterosexism, ableism, and so on, how those things are really, causing problems that then we're turning to, we're receiving these individualized diagnoses that say, oh, the problem is this little thing happening in your brain, and it doesn't have anything to do with all this other things happening in your life. And we really need to reevaluate that. And in that sense, I think, Erich Fromm's approach, for example, is very needed, because he did sort of look at the ways that psychology and is connected with sort of the broader social life. And that is where I think we need to put a lot of focus. And it's important both for individuals to have a sense, I think, to have a sense of, oh, this is not just a personal problem. This is fit in with larger social issues. Even if you don't have the capacity to make changes immediately, like, changing the economy, that's a big task. So, but even if you don't have the capacity to make those changes, to understand where the pressures are coming from, and so it's not all just sort of a self-blame game, or diverting into just like the brain. Oh, it's just my brain that has this problem, or genetics or something. But to really understand, like, no, the source of the problem is here. Is the fact that my boss is mistreating me, and I'm one slip up away from being out of work, and that would mean maybe I get evicted, and all these other problems. That we don't have to have a society that works like that, and people don't have to be put under those types of pressures. And I think that's really where the emphasis needs to be, is how all of that happens. And then, capitalism through pharmaceutical companies, they package the solution as this, like, here's a pill that you can take, and that's your solution, and that's your only solution. And again, I don't begrudge anyone who takes the pills. I've taken some of the psychiatric meds myself, but I think it's fine as a tool, but it's not a good analysis, and doesn't get us to the long-term issues.
Shouldn't pacify us into zombie-like existence. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. May I add? So, because I know, according to the National Center for Health and Statistics, 1 in 10 Americans take an antidepressant, but less than a third of those taking an antidepressant have seen a mental health professional in the last year. basically. So when you think about it, as Karen mentioned, like, yes, that here's a pill. Meanwhile, I have to admit that, and I also have to honor my own boundaries. I was planning before my own breast cancer diagnosis, I was planning to run groups because I have this long wait list. I'm one of the few in the area that accepts like Medicaid and some other health insurances. Because let's face it, many of them do not pay well and they pay delayed. So that's, as you can see, it's a structural issue. And then people are not able to access mental health resources, leaving them at the mercy of a pill if they are able to see a psychiatrist, because that is also very pricey. And if they do, we're talking about relying on a pill and not the individual's strength and the community, alongside that individual, and the structure that is hindering or not that individual's ability to succeed. And so I just wanted to add that, because that is something that comes up frequently.
No, absolutely, so important. And if they do see a psychiatrist for any amount of time, it's like 2 seconds. Okay, what are you taking?
Yes.
How much? Sounds good. You all right? There you go. Next. No, yes. It's so true. And gosh, we got only couple more minutes. But again, Erich Fromm was one of those psychoanalysts who went beyond the narrow medical model you were talking about, Kerwin. He wrote books like The Sane Society, Escape from Freedom, The Loving Society, and so on. And I might add, he identified himself as a socialist. So, and he generally, talked about that. Yeah, in the way that we all sort of, we're all talking about to go beyond ourselves, to care for our neighbor, for our community, that when somebody else is hurting, we're going to be hurting. And we've gotten into this bind where we don't do that. We don't do that. We hunker down in our silos and, too bad if that's what's happening, as long as it doesn't happen to me. But so listen, we got about a minute to go, and I want to just get your final thoughts, both of you, and again, how people might reach you for to further discussion. And should we start with you, Kerwin?
Sure. I would just say, if people are interested in some of the following up on some of these things, that they take a look at madinamerica.com, which I think has provided some really wonderful resources, alternative resources ways to think about mental health. And I can be reached through my email at Wesleyan, and you can just look up Kerwin Kaye, Wesleyan University, and you will rapidly get to my email.
Mad in America. I'm not aware of that. I'm going to check that out. And Karina, tell us how we can reach you. You're on 136th Street there? Well,
yes.
Yes. I know, doing virtual.
But you can basically reach me at info@karinaaybar.com or karinaaybar.com. And for some content, some live, I like to host some live with individuals such as Karen. Go to Instagram at the Karina Aybar. And I just want to emphasize, you're not alone, and the structural fallacies and problems are not your fault. So please do seek help if you are in need.
Absolutely. That's a great final thought. And I really want to thank both of you. This has been really enlightening. That the time has flown on here. I mean, I look up, it's 50, we've got to go. I'm so sorry. It's really been enlightening. I know our audience is going to really gain a lot from it. And again, all the best, and stay well and stay strong. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to have you both on.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for watching us again this week on The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and we'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
I needed the shelter of someone's arms, and there you were. I needed someone to understand my ups and downs, and there you were. And thank you, baby. I want to start. And thank you, baby. How sweet it is to be loved by you. Oh, how sweet it is to be loved by you. I close my eyes at night and wondering where could I be without you in my life. Everything I did was just a bore, and everywhere I went seems I've been there before. But you brighten up all of my days with a love so sweet in so many ways. I wanna stop and thank you, baby.